What are your initial thoughts when you've listened to all these 4 presentations and the challenges of decarbonization?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And thank you to all the speakers for this really interesting, very, very broad panel here. I found it really interesting that they talked both from the side of technological solutions, but also from the demand side and the behavioral solutions that we need to achieve a deep decarbonization. What I found sort of interesting is that you all mentioned quite radical solutions and solutions that will certainly sort of endanger incumbents' business models. So you all brought up solutions which are novel, innovative, but which will create something that we call, as economists, stranded assets to incumbents' industries and to incumbents' businesses. So my first question would probably be, and it could be a question to all of you, how do we deal with those potential stranded assets, and how do we bring on board those incumbents that will be threatened to lose their revenues, to lose their business models, and how do we actually motivate them, if you want to use a little more diplomatic word, to participate in the energy transition, because we need to be afraid of them being rather opposed to participating in a decarbonization effort. And it's actually a topic that we will also address in a workshop as part of this Energy Transition Week later on Wednesday, where we named it hard choices in the energy transition. I think that's a very correct term. Yeah. It's about some hard choices between innovative, attractive future solutions and, letting some of the traditional business models behind us. But can we just accept that, or do we have a little more in terms of incentives? And I think it's a question that both deals with the energy sector, but also with the transportation sector very much. Jillian mentioned that it's easier for Norway because there is no domestic automotive industry. I know from Germany how hard it is here. So what can we do in a country like ours to get the traditional industry on board?
Well, I'm looking at both Jillian and Grete here, so I don't know who should go first. So the first one to raise her hand will get the word first. So I'm looking at you. Grete, you were first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a really good question, and I think stranded assets. Of course, oil and gas companies and the large oil and gas companies are very worried about this, but I would have to say that this has been on the agenda for quite some years. And as a business, we need to prepare. And I believe most companies have started that restructuring or thinking about this. And as technology developers, we need to find the solutions. And I do believe there will be some oil and gas fields that will not be developed because of emissions. But that's also fine. We then need to develop and produce the oil and gas from the lowest emitter assets that we can get, because I do believe we will still need energy from oil and gas. But then secondly, we just have to clean the use of this, like making blue hydrogen out of the gas. This is cleaning the gas we produce. So I think it's possible. And then you talk about the automotive industry. Yes, but what we see in Norway now is that most of your branded car factories are actually making EVs, and they're turning their production over to EVs, I guess, gradually. So they're also adapting, like the oil and gas industry.
Thank you, Grete. Jillian, would you like to comment on the question of the stranded assets?
Yeah, I suppose the point is that there will be stranded assets if we don't act quickly enough. So the issue of stranded assets is there whether we change now or we don't. And as far as incumbents are concerned, I think, whilst some are dragging their feet, all are in the main making transitions at the moment. And what they need is, and we've heard this already, they need certainty, they need a level playing field. And although certain types of regulation and actions by government are difficult to enact, once they are enacted, so I'm talking here mainly regulation, then businesses, history has shown us that the claims by a lot of businesses of the costs that it's going to take them to adjust to that regulation are way overinflated, and innovation can kick in and make adjustments. With respect to the automotive industry, there are changes already happening, but nowhere near quick enough, because the profits are largely still being made where we don't want them to be being made, in the larger, heavier vehicles, for instance. So again, they need to have the encouragement to change those supply lines away from these larger vehicles by knowing that consumers are not going to want them anymore, because they're going to be made too expensive through various tax regimes. But also, with respect to the automotive industry, it's not just like any solution that we look at, even when you look at the automotive industry, which is all about cars and technology, their diversification is also into totally new business models around supplying mobility solutions rather than just supplying cars. Not just about individual car ownership, but about moving in, as some of them are, into the space of car sharing and different ways of giving people access to those cars. So when we think about diversification, when we think about stranded assets, we think about whether we can have what we've got now or not have what we've got now. But a lot of what we've got now can be transitioned into something very innovative and very new, and there's no reason to think why those things can't also have value chain and good business models behind them.
Thank you, Jillian. And by that, you're actually responding to a couple of the questions that came in from the audience. So thank you so much. And I've noticed that, Henrik, I think you've, I don't know if you're just pointing your pen. No, I actually think you wanted the word as well. Go ahead.
Sure. I just want to build on something that Jillian said very early on. You know, there will be stranded assets. We actually did some analytical work on this, because I think if you were to hold the climate targets firm, right, and say we do want to decarbonize, then it's actually better to do it gradually, steadily, rather than kind of try to postpone the pain, because then you get a lot of pain at the end, right? So it's much better to actually do a kind of smooth trajectory than a kind of, realize in 2040 that we need to decarbonize everything by 2050. Then you get a lot of stranded assets. And I actually think that if we look at the two industries that we have been discussing, so the energy industry, we've seen a massive amount of change, and we've seen, companies completely transforming themselves and reinventing themselves, including quite a share of stranded assets in the form of manifesting itself as impairments, right? And we now see that, the largest utilities in Europe, they are predominantly renewable. They talk about renewable, they talk about sustainable development goals. That's really what's happening in the utility industry in Europe.
So the discourse is changing in a way.
Indeed, and we see the same in the automotive industry. My personal kind of analysis of the Volkswagen Group is that if electric vehicles don't happen, then Volkswagen Group is in trouble. Yeah. They have basically bet the company on the electric vehicle change happening in terms of investments and the amount of money they're now putting into it.
Thank you, Henrik. Annemie, I think I saw your hand raised as well, so I'm going to give you a short comment before we let Mark as well join the discussion. So go ahead, Annemie.
Of course. No, I just noticed the similarity between all of the different talks we've had and the answers we can give to this very relevant question. So also in terms of cities, Ålesund in Norway was the first city to have a digital twin for the city, which actually came from the maritime sector. The technology for it came from the maritime sector, and they switched into the cities, carbon neutral cities field. In Stavanger was the first generation of European lighthouse projects for smart cities. exactly because they needed to switch from oil to smart digitalization in the city. In Trondheim now, we are working with the energy companies, with mobility providers, with digital companies to look at new business models that combine all of these and that work more on energy flexibility. So yes, there are concrete examples of all of this happening. And as the last speaker said, if you do it gradually, if you see where do we need to be in 2030, so what do we need to do now in order to get there, which changes do we gradually need to make, it will be much easier to get there.
Thank you. Now, Mark, finally, we're going to give the word to you as well. I see that you've been taking notes. I hope that you are right-handed, because I noticed that your left arm is not that mobile. So go ahead, Mark. I think you're muted, Mark. Sorry. There you go, I hope. Try again.
Okay, I was just going to say that was a biking accident, so biking is bad for you. You shouldn't be biking at all.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Okay, so look, I'll leave it up to you. You're the moderator. You can curtail me if you wish, and you can direct me whatever way you want. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very encouraged by what I've heard here today. I know it's a big effort we have to do, but I've been in this business over 20 years, and the way it has changed. People like me 20 years ago were sort of by ourselves, so to speak, and it's very encouraging over the last 2 years to see so many people now engaged in this area. So I think that's very positive. I have sort of two questions, well, many more, but I'm going to ask sort of two questions. One is a Norwegian specific question, and the other is a more global. Just on the Norwegian, the speaker from Statkraft, etc. Electrification, which is my own area of power systems. I mean, it's really easy for the Norwegians to talk about it because they have an enormous amount of hydro, and for all sorts of technical reasons I won't go into. It makes, if you've got hydro, you're already there essentially. And, from a synchronous power system point of view and all sorts of very technical issues, it's extremely easy for Norway to talk about electrification, but it's not that easy to talk about it if you don't have hydro. If you're the Irish power system, for example, you don't have hydro, you don't have synchronous generation, etc. So I think that, we have during this session, we've definitely underestimated the difficulty of decarbonization through electricity. It is not that easy. It's pretty easy in places like Norway, Quebec, and various places, but globally it's very, very difficult. So I'd like to, so if you try to globify this, it's not that easy. Just from the Equinor point of view, I'm very glad to hear that Equinor have decided by 2050 to be carbon neutral, including the end use, which is good. A lot of oil companies have come out and said carbon neutral, but in terms of production, which is a bit of a con, but which is good, which is extremely good. And I'm also glad to hear that at some stage Equinor will actually leave some of the oil in the ground. That's what I took as the answer to the question. But if it doesn't work, I want to know, will you be willing to leave it in the ground? I think that's a very important question. At some stage, leaving it in the ground is actually the right thing to do. So I want to know from Equinor, when does that happen? When are you going to make that decision? Are you going to keep pushing CCS, or will you eventually leave it in the ground? To get a broader question, I think Jillian and Annemie actually have proposed to us a completely different sort of view of life, which is, change how you live. I mean, I'm obviously a cyclist, as you can see. And actually I live in a house that I bought right beside the school. I actually have we have a car between myself and my wife and my daughter, but we only have one car. We deliberately bought a house where we are because we could we could actually survive completely without any driving. However, I'd have to admit, I'm probably one of those 1% of people who travel. I mean, before the pandemic, I traveled 260,000 miles in 2019. So I'm probably a sinner in that regard. But my question is where does the balance become between these two solutions? The sort of the grandiose Equinor, CCS, large amount of capital solution, and the live locally, act locally. They're two totally different paradigms. And I want to know, is anyone doing any work on where the balance is between these two? I'll leave it at that.
Great, Mark. Thank you so much. Right, so these three questions, as they are, great ones too, I will let the four of them actually reply to them rather quickly. And I just have to add, and this is for the technical team more or less, I think we can allow for a 5-minute, going over a bit, 5 minutes, just to get sure to get these perspectives covered. If the panel agrees, of course. If all of a sudden some of you have to leave, please feel free to do so. But we'll start with Henrik and the question about, are you underestimating the challenges of deep decarbonization when you, operating in hydro, which is easy for us in Norway?
No, I think we are developing renewable energy everywhere, and in particular in Ireland, to be frank, both wind and solar, and also batteries and stabilizers in order to create the power grid that can actually deal with a high renewables share. And when we talk about our experience and our analysis, this is a kind of European-wide and also a global analysis. And that basically shows that you can get to high renewable shares, so 80, maybe 90%, depending on the starting point you have, with kind of reasonable costs. And then, true, it's, as for every sector, like I said in my speech, difficult to get to the last mile. But that, to me, is almost like, let's get there first and then face that challenge. And even, with lower renewable shares like 40, 50, 60%, it really starts to make sense to electrify the other sectors, because you also have tremendous efficiency gains. So, yes, it's a big challenge. Lots of stuff needs to be done. Lots of things needs to be built. But I think the logic of decarbonizing your power sector and then electrifying what can be electrified, and then, like we've heard, other solutions like both green and blue hydrogen, etc., are really, really the basic building blocks, and to me the only credible route that anyone has described to even get close to 2 degrees, or for that matter 1.5 degrees.
Thank you, Henrik. So we'll quickly moving on to Equinor and Grete, and just with Mark, I'm also curious to know whether you've set a date for when the decision is going to be made to leave assets underground.
It's so that we leave assets underground. What we do is actually to optimize our portfolio so that we have the least emitting oil and gas assets in our portfolio. And as I said earlier, intensity target is 8 kilos CO2 per barrel of oil equivalents produced by 2025. So in 4 years, the industry average is double than that. And why is it? Well, because we actually focused on having a portfolio with low emission assets. And we will continue to optimize our portfolio to reduce the emissions. And an example is that we left the oil sands in Canada some years ago. They had quite high emissions, and that was partly the reason. So what we also do, we're not exiting oil and gas at all, but what we are doing is we're testing every dollar we invest in oil and gas. We are adding a cost element to the CO2 emissions, so to make sure this is sustainable also when we think about this emission target we have. In addition to that, we look at how can we make sure we can have CCS to compensate for all emissions. And when it comes to gas, we can do that by creating blue hydrogen. When it comes to oil, it's harder. We are working on solutions. If we can't find solutions for all our oil production, we will have to offer CCS for other industries to compensate for this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So now we have a couple of minutes to move on to the final question from Mark, which goes to both Jillian and Annemie. Where is the balance between technology and deep decarbonization on that side, and also the more local alternatives and ways of living, changing the way of living that people, the choices they will have to make. So I don't know if we should start with maybe with Annemie, since you've been talking a lot about the citizens' role here. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I would ask the question why they have to be two different things. So for us, I would see them as one project. What we always try to do is to see, so what can be improved in the local communities or in a city, both in terms of quality of life, maybe the time of commuting, the air quality, lowering the chance of getting flooding, for example, or what would it take for people then to make more low emission choices. And how could then a digital solution or technology or any other tool or process help achieve that? So it is actually two phases and two parts of the same answer. And the whole point is that if you put technology experts and then, for example, designers or other creative cultural experts together from the very start with the citizens, you will find the good balance, one solution that is a good balance between these different approaches. You can't do that on a global scale immediately, but I do think we need both, and ideally we need them together and not as separate tracks.
Thank you. Jillian, you're going to have the last word actually now, and you've already heard the question, but also there's another question from the audience that I could sort of just put on there. If we get there, that where we are using less cars, we already have a lot of cars in the world, and these are becoming stranded assets in a way, rejected by the Western world and stranding somewhere else in other geographical areas. And in the name of fair, just and sustainable, how do we avoid that? So you can maybe add that into your answer. Go ahead, Jillian.
Okay, I mean, I completely agree that this isn't an either-or question, it's a both-and question. And broadly, the technology versus behaviour dichotomy is not a helpful one. That we need both, but also you can't divorce them in the sense that in order to get the technologies and the technology breakthroughs and the technology adoption rates that we need, that is a behavioural and societal and political economy set of solutions as much as it is a technological set of solutions. So it's very difficult to divorce. But in terms of this idea that there are these, in a way, two different paradigms, because you have some solutions which are really quite far off. They're still not even invented yet. They're not proven yet, but we're still relying on them in our models, such as CCS, I would argue. Then if you want to talk there about where the balance lies in terms of analysis that's being done, I mean, all models that look at pathways are suggesting we can't do it without CCS, etc. But if you look at the short term and what I was saying about what needs to be done by 2030, and for transport that we would have used up all our budget by 2030 at current rates, then these solutions are completely irrelevant. So over the longer term, they're relevant and we can't do without them. But in the short term, and to do the things that we have to do to keep us safe, which is what we have to do in the next 10 years, they're actually not relevant. So it all depends on the timescales that you're looking at. And then finally on this issue of stranded assets and cars, the fact that the cars that we buy and consume in the Western world, if you like, so many of them end up in other parts of the world to get used. This is why we have to regulate really stringent regulations on the types of cars that we are selling into the market now. None of these future target dates for 2030 banning this and stopping this. We have to stop selling those cars into the market now because they are locking in fossil fuel vehicles in our countries and then elsewhere for many decades to come.
Thank you very much. Now, we are running over time, and I just wanted to say thank you to all 4 speakers for very interesting perspectives. Like someone pointed out, this was a very broad topic, ranging from technological to societal, both challenges and possibilities. So thank you to all 4 of you. Thank you to Franziska and to Mark. And maybe you felt like you didn't get that much time in the limelight today. But the thing is, you ask so very nice questions that the panel, the rest of the panel, spent their time replying to it. So you should be proud of yourselves, and I hope that your arm mark is going to be better soon, and be careful when you're cycling. Thank you also to the audience for questions. We have sort of indirectly responded to several of them, I think, as far as I can tell. So thank you very much.